There is a particular kind of loneliness that only another alcoholic can fully recognize. It is not simply the loneliness of being physically alone. It is the loneliness of standing in a room full of people who love you, who are trying everything they know to help you, and feeling, underneath all of it, that you are utterly and completely alone with something no one else can touch. That was the loneliness Bill Wilson carried for years before anything changed. And understanding how that loneliness was finally broken is, in many ways, the story of how Alcoholics Anonymous itself came into being. Bill Wilson was born in 1895 in a small village in Vermont, in circumstances that were already unstable before he ever took his first drink. His parents separated when he was still a boy, and he was raised largely by his grandparents. He was intelligent, restless, and deeply sensitive to feelings of inadequacy. Feelings that would follow him long into adulthood no matter how much external success he achieved. As a young man, he showed real talent, particularly in engineering and later in the world of finance. But alongside that talent ran a persistent undercurrent of self-doubt that never quite left him alone. He served as an officer during the First World War, and it was there, in the social world of army life, that he took his first real drink. He would later describe how that first drink did something for him that nothing else in his life ever had. It didn't simply relax him, it seemed to complete him. The awkwardness and insecurity that had followed him for years seemed to dissolve, and in their place came a sense of ease and confidence that felt, to him, like finally becoming the person he was always meant to be. This is a detail worth sitting with, because it explains something crucial about how his drinking began. It wasn't simply an escape from pain. It was, at least at first, an answer to a problem he had never been able to solve any other way. After the war, Bill returned to civilian life and threw himself into the world of Wall Street. At a time when the stock market seemed to offer boundless opportunity, he had a natural aptitude for understanding businesses and investments, and for a period of years he genuinely thrived. He and his wife, Lois, traveled, socialized, and built a life that from the outside looked increasingly successful. But running parallel to that success was a drinking pattern that grew steadily heavier and increasingly difficult to control, even though for a long time Bill was convinced he could stop whenever he decided to. This is one of the most important threads running through his story, and through the story of countless alcoholics who would later find their way into the fellowship he helped create. The conviction, held with complete sincerity, that control was always just one decision away. Bill made promises to himself and to Lois repeatedly. He would swear off drinking entirely, sometimes for weeks or months at a stretch, and each time he managed to stop, it reinforced his belief that he was fundamentally in control of the situation, that his drinking was a matter of willpower rather than something deeper. And each time he started again, usually after some new stress or some new success that seemed to call for a celebratory drink, the drinking returned heavier than before. The stock market crash of 1929 devastated Bill's finances along with millions of others, and it marked a turning point in the severity of his drinking. What had been a serious but still somewhat containable problem began, over the following years, to consume nearly everything around it. Business opportunities fell apart because of drinking. Friendships eroded. Lois worked to support the household while Bill's own prospects collapsed again and again, often at the exact moment when things seemed to be turning around. There is a particular cruelty in this pattern that Bill understood intimately by the time he was done living it. The drinking would destroy an opportunity. He would sober up out of necessity and rebuild something promising, and then, almost as if drawn by some force he couldn't explain, he would drink again just as things started to work, destroying what he had just rebuilt. By the early 1930s, Bill Wilson had become, by any honest description, a man in the final stages of alcoholism. He was hospitalized multiple times for treatment, each time leaving with genuine intentions to stay sober, and each time returning to drinking within a matter of weeks. Doctors who treated him during this period were direct with both Bill and Lois about what they were witnessing. This was no longer simply a bad habit or a lack of discipline. His body and mind had reached a point where continued drinking was likely to end in death. either through the physical toll of the alcohol itself or through some accident that would occur while under its influence. One physician in particular, Dr. William Silkworth, who would later become an important figure in the early history of Alcoholics Anonymous, explained to Bill something that reframed the entire problem in a way Bill had never considered, that his condition might be better understood not simply as a moral failing or a weakness of character, but as something closer to an allergy of the body combined with an obsession of the mind, a combination that made normal drinking, for people like him, permanently impossible. This idea planted something in Bill that would matter enormously later, even though at the time it didn't stop him from drinking. It offered for the first time a way of understanding his condition that wasn't simply an endless cycle of shame and broken willpower, but understanding a problem intellectually and actually breaking free from it are two very different things. And Bill continued to drink, continued to be hospitalized, and continued to watch his life narrow further and further around alcohol, even as he genuinely wanted, with real desperation, for it to be otherwise. It was during this period of near-total collapse that an old friend from his drinking days, a man named Ebby Thacker, came to visit him. Bill and Ebby had been drinking companions for years, and Bill fully expected that this visit would be like so many others, two old friends sharing a drink and reminiscing. Instead, Bill was startled to find Ebby completely sober, calm, and, in a way Bill couldn't quite articulate at first, different. Ebby explained that he had stopped drinking through contact with a religiously oriented fellowship known as the Oxford Group, and that a central part of what had helped him was something deceptively simple: honestly admitting the true extent of his problem to another person, and opening himself to the possibility of help from a power greater than himself. Bill's reaction to this was complicated, and it's worth pausing on that complication, because so many people who eventually find their way into recovery pass through something similar. Bill considered himself, at this point in his life, essentially agnostic. He had grown skeptical of organized religion years earlier, and the idea of surrendering to some undefined higher power struck him, at least initially, as exactly the kind of vague spiritual comfort that intelligent, rational people were supposed to see through. And yet, sitting across from a friend who had been just as lost as he was, and who now sat there sober, calm, and clearly at peace in a way Bill hadn't seen in years, he couldn't simply dismiss what he was witnessing. Something in Ebby's presence carried more weight than any argument could have. Not long after this visit, Bill found himself once again in the hospital, admitted for treatment under the care of Dr. Silkworth, in what would turn out to be his final hospitalization for alcoholism. He was, by his own later account, at the absolute bottom of everything he had ever experienced. Physically depleted, emotionally shattered, and for the first time in his life, genuinely without any remaining confidence that he could solve this problem through his own effort and intelligence, the very qualities that had carried him through so much of his life up to that point. It was in this state of complete defeat that something happened which Bill would spend the rest of his life trying to describe accurately, and which became, in the retelling by generations of recovering alcoholics after him, one of the most significant moments in the entire history of the fellowship. Alone in his hospital room, having reached what felt like the absolute end of his own resources, Bill found himself almost involuntarily crying out for help, not to any specific concept of God he had previously believed in, but simply to whatever might exist beyond himself, if anything did at all. What followed, according to his own description, was an experience unlike anything he had known before. A sudden and overwhelming sense of light and presence filling the room, accompanied by a feeling of peace and release that seemed to dissolve, in an instant, the desperate compulsion that had controlled him for years. He described feeling, in that moment, that he was in the presence of something vast and benevolent, and that whatever had been driving him toward destruction had, at least in that moment, been lifted entirely. It's important to sit with how remarkable and how uncertain this moment was, even for Bill himself in the immediate aftermath. He didn't fully trust his own experience at first. Lying in that hospital bed, He wondered seriously whether what had happened was a genuine spiritual experience or simply a symptom of his damaged physical and mental state after years of heavy drinking. It was Dr. Silkworth, of all people, who offered him a form of reassurance, telling Bill that whatever had happened, something had clearly shifted, and that he should hold on to it rather than analyze it away. What followed that experience was not, contrary to how such stories are sometimes simplified, an instant and effortless transformation into a new life. Bill remained deeply uncertain about many of the theological questions that the experience raised. But something fundamental had changed in how he approached the problem of his own drinking. Where he had spent years trying to manage his alcoholism through willpower, intelligence, and control, he now approached it from an entirely different posture. A willingness to admit, completely and without reservation, that he could not manage this on his own, and an openness to relying on something beyond himself, however imperfectly he understood what that something actually was. From that point forward, Bill Wilson never drank again for the rest of his life. But what makes his story matter so profoundly, far beyond simply being an account of one man's personal recovery, is what he did next. He became consumed with a sense that this experience, whatever it truly was, needed to be shared with other alcoholics, that there was something in what had happened to him that might offer the same possibility of release to countless others who were trapped exactly as he had been. He began speaking with other alcoholics, sharing his own story openly, offering what had helped him without any pretense of having all the answers. Many of these early efforts failed. Bill approached alcoholic after alcoholic with his story and his newfound conviction, and time after time the men he spoke with listened politely, sometimes with real interest, and then went back to drinking exactly as before. This period was, by Bill's own account, deeply discouraging. He began to wonder whether what had happened to him was simply unique to his own circumstances, something that couldn't actually be transmitted or shared with anyone else, no matter how sincerely he tried. It was during a business trip to Akron, Ohio, at a moment when a failed deal had left Bill standing alone in a hotel lobby with the old familiar pull toward a drink beginning to rise inside him, that something crucial occurred to him. He realized, standing in that lobby, that what he needed at that exact moment wasn't willpower or distraction. What he needed was another alcoholic to talk to. Not to help them, particularly, but because he understood, with sudden clarity, that helping another alcoholic was the one thing that had consistently kept his own obsession with drinking at bay. Reaching out wasn't simply an act of generosity towards someone else. It was, in a very real sense, how he stayed sober himself. Through a series of phone calls and introductions, this impulse led Bill to a local physician named Dr. Robert Smith, known to history as Dr. Bob, a man whose own struggle with alcohol had brought his medical career and his family life to the edge of complete ruin. Their first conversation, which both men later described as lasting for hours, was unlike anything either of them had experienced with anyone trying to help them before. Bill didn't lecture Dr. Bob or try to convince him of anything. He simply told his own story, honestly and without embellishment, as one alcoholic speaking to another, both of them fully aware of exactly what the other had lived through, without needing to explain or justify it. Dr. Bob would later describe this encounter as the first time he had ever spoken to someone who truly understood, from the inside, exactly what he was dealing with. Not a doctor treating a patient, not a family member pleading out of love and desperation. Another alcoholic, speaking honestly about his own struggle, without judgment, and without any attempt to fix the other person from a position of superiority. Dr. Bob continued to drink for a short period after this initial meeting, but the connection between the two men held, and not long after, Dr. Bob had his own final drink, a date that is now recognized as the founding moment of Alcoholics Anonymous. What Bill and Dr. Bob discovered together, almost by accident, in that hotel lobby moment and the conversation that followed, became the foundational insight of the entire fellowship that grew from it. That one alcoholic talking honestly to another alcoholic, without pretense, without hierarchy, and without professional distance, had a power to help that nothing else Bill had encountered ever managed to replicate. This wasn't a technique they had designed deliberately. It emerged out of raw necessity, out of two desperate men reaching for whatever might actually work, and finding, almost by surprise, that it did. From this single relationship between Bill and Dr. Bob, a fellowship began to grow, first slowly, one struggling alcoholic at a time, meeting in living rooms and hospital rooms, with no formal organization, no professional staff, and no guaranteed method beyond the simple practice of one alcoholic honestly sharing his story with another who needed to hear it. Over the following years, this informal network of men and women helping each other stay sober grew into something significant enough that Bill Wilson and the early members felt compelled to write down what they had learned, both for the sake of the people who were already part of this growing fellowship, and for the countless others still suffering alone who might never otherwise hear that recovery was possible. That effort to write down what had been learned became the book that carries Bill's story as its opening chapter. A book written not as a theoretical or theological treatise, but as a direct, practical account addressed from one alcoholic to another, meant to be read by someone standing exactly where Bill himself had once stood, isolated, defeated, and quietly convinced that there was no way out. The story of how Bill Wilson arrived at that hospital room, at that moment of complete surrender, and eventually at that hotel lobby conversation with Dr. Bob was placed first, before any instructions, before any steps, before any explanation of program or principle, because everything that followed depended entirely on establishing one simple point first: that this problem, as hopeless as it seemed, had actually been overcome by someone who had lived through exactly the same darkness. What makes Bill's story endure, decades after it was first written down, is not primarily the details of his particular hospital room experience, remarkable as that moment was to him personally. It is the pattern underneath the story that continues to resonate with anyone who has ever felt trapped by something they could not control through willpower alone. The years of believing that the next attempt at control would finally be the one that worked, the mounting evidence that it never quite did, the eventual collapse of that belief entirely, and then, unexpectedly, not a solution born of more effort or more intelligence, but one born of complete surrender and of one human being reaching out honestly to another. That pattern, first lived by Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob in Akron, Ohio, and then written down so it could be shared, became the foundation upon which entire fellowship, still active and still growing nearly a century later, was built. Bill's story is much more than the story of a man who drank too much. It is the story of a man who slowly lost control of his own life while desperately trying to convince himself that he was still in control. And perhaps that is what makes his story so powerful. Because alcoholism does not always begin with a person believing that they are destroying their life. Sometimes it begins with the belief that they can handle it, that they are different, that they can stop whenever they want, that tomorrow will be different, that one more drink will not matter. And for a while, life may even appear to prove them right. The person may continue working. They may maintain relationships. They may achieve success. They may appear confident. They may convince themselves and everyone around them that there is no real problem. But little by little, something changes. The drinking becomes more important. The consequences become more serious. The promises become more frequent. And the distance between the person they want to be and the person they are becoming becomes greater. Bill W.'s story takes us into that painful contradiction. He was not simply a man who enjoyed drinking. He was a man who eventually discovered that his relationship with alcohol had become stronger than his own intentions. He could make promises. He could make plans. He could sincerely want to stop. And yet, when the obsession returned, his intentions were no longer enough. That is one of the most important lessons contained in his story. Wanting to stop and being able to stop are not always the same thing. A person can genuinely hate what alcohol is doing to their life and still return to it. They can promise their family that it will never happen again and sincerely mean it. They can experience consequences that should be enough to make anyone stop. And yet, the obsession can return. This is why Bill's story is not simply about weakness. It is about the terrifying reality of addiction. It is about what happens when a substance becomes more powerful than the person's ability to control their own behavior. And perhaps this is where many people finally begin to understand that alcoholism cannot always be solved by willpower alone. For years, a person may believe, I just need more discipline. I need to try harder. I need to control myself. I need to prove that I can stop. But the repeated failure to do so can eventually create something even more destructive: shame. The person begins to believe that they are morally defective, that they are weak, that they are worthless, that they have disappointed everyone. And shame tells them to hide. But hiding creates isolation. Isolation creates more pain. And pain can lead back to drinking. The cycle continues. Bill's story shows us what happens when that cycle becomes impossible to ignore. Eventually, something has to change. And perhaps one of the most important moments in recovery is the moment when a person stops asking, how can I prove that I can control this? And finally asks, what if I cannot do this alone? That question can feel like defeat. But in recovery, it can become the beginning of freedom. Because admitting that you need help is not necessarily a sign that you have lost. Sometimes it is the first honest thing you have said in years. Bill's experience also introduces one of the central principles that would become foundational to Alcoholics Anonymous: one alcoholic helping another alcoholic. There is something uniquely powerful about being understood by someone who has lived through the same darkness. Not someone who simply tells you what you should do, not someone who judges you from the outside, but someone who can say, I know what this feels like. I have been there. I know what it is like to make promises and break them. I know what it is like to wake up and regret what happened. I know what it is like to believe that this time will be different. That kind of identification can break through a wall that advice alone cannot penetrate. Because sometimes a person does not need another lecture. They need to know that they are not alone. They need to see that another alcoholic survived, that another person found a way out, that their story does not have to end where it is currently standing. And that is one reason Bill's story continues to matter. It was not simply the story of his drinking. It became part of the foundation of a fellowship built around identification, honesty, spiritual growth, service, and mutual support. But perhaps there is another lesson hidden inside Bill's story. Recovery is not simply about removing alcohol from a person's life. It is about discovering what needs to change underneath the drinking. Because if alcohol was being used to escape pain, loneliness, fear, insecurity, resentment, or a sense of emptiness, simply removing the alcohol does not automatically resolve everything. Sobriety can create space, but what we do with that space becomes part of recovery. A person begins to look at themselves honestly. They begin to examine their behavior. They begin to repair relationships. They begin to accept responsibility. They begin to develop a different relationship with their emotions. They begin to understand that recovery is not merely about avoiding a drink. It is about learning how to live. And perhaps that is why Bill's story remains relevant to people who have never experienced alcoholism themselves. Because underneath the story of alcohol is a universal human struggle. The struggle between the person we know we could become and the person we have allowed ourselves to become. Many people have something in their lives that they cannot control. It may not be alcohol. It may be anger, resentment, compulsive behavior, pride, fear, approval, work relationships, the need to control everything, the need to escape uncomfortable emotions. And the lesson remains, sometimes freedom begins with honesty. Not the honesty we show other people, the honesty we show ourselves. Bill eventually had to confront a reality that he could no longer negotiate with. His life could not continue as it had been. And perhaps every person reaches a moment when they must decide whether they will continue protecting the life they have created or become willing to build a different one. That decision can be terrifying, because change requires surrendering something familiar. Even when the familiar is destroying us, it is still familiar. Alcohol may be destroying a person's life, but the person knows what life with alcohol looks like. Recovery is different. It requires walking into uncertainty. It requires admitting that you do not have all the answers. It requires accepting help. It requires developing trust. It requires taking one day at a time. And perhaps that is why the message of Alcoholics Anonymous has resonated with so many people. It does not demand that someone solve the rest of their life today. It invites them to take the next step, just for today, just for this moment, just for this decision. That idea can be incredibly powerful, because someone who believes they must stay sober for the rest of their life may feel overwhelmed. But someone who says, "Today, I will not drink," has a concrete decision in front of them. Recovery becomes a series of toe days, a series of choices, a series of moments in which a person learns to live differently. And Bill's story reminds us that transformation does not always begin with confidence. Sometimes it begins with desperation. Sometimes it begins with exhaustion. Sometimes it begins when a person finally realizes that the old way is no longer working. And that moment, although painful, can become a doorway into honesty, a doorway into humility, a doorway into connection, a doorway into spiritual awakening, a doorway into service, a doorway into a completely different life. Perhaps the greatest message of Bill's story is not that Bill was a perfect man who suddenly discovered the perfect answer. It is that a man who had reached the limits of his own ability found another way to live. And that possibility remains one of the most hopeful messages in recovery. Your past can explain you without having to define you. The things you did while drinking are part of your story. The people you hurt are part of your story. The opportunities you lost are part of your story. The mistakes you made are part of your story. But they do not necessarily have to be the final chapter. Recovery creates the possibility of writing something different, not by pretending the past never happened, but by facing it honestly, learning from it, making amends where possible, and using the experience to help someone else who is still trapped where you once were. That may be one of the most beautiful transformations in recovery. The wound that once represented only pain can eventually become a source of empathy. The experience that once brought shame can eventually become a message of hope. The past that once seemed like a prison can become a bridge to another person's recovery. And perhaps that is why Bill's story had to be told, not because Bill was extraordinary, but because his experience could become useful to someone else. Someone sitting alone, someone hiding their drinking, someone who has promised to stop, someone who has tried everything, someone who is terrified that they are beyond help, someone who believes they have already destroyed too much, someone who thinks they are the only person in the world who cannot control their drinking. To that person, Bill's story can say, "You are not the only one. There is a way forward. You do not have to understand the entire journey today. You do not have to fix everything today. You do not have to become a completely different person overnight. You only have to become willing to take the next honest step." And perhaps that is where Bill's story ultimately leaves us. Not with a promise that recovery will be easy, not with the illusion that the past can be erased, but with something much more valuable: hope. Hope that a person can change. Hope that broken relationships can sometimes be repaired. Hope that shame does not have to be permanent. Hope that isolation can be replaced by connection. Hope that despair can be replaced by purpose. Hope that one alcoholic can help another. And hope that a life that once seemed completely out of control can eventually become a life of sobriety, responsibility, service, and meaning. So as we close this chapter, perhaps the most important question is not, what happened to Bill? The deeper question is, what can Bill's story teach us about our own lives? It teaches us that denial can keep us trapped, that isolation can make addiction stronger, that willpower has limits, that asking for help can be an act of courage, that identification can create connection, that recovery is not simply about stopping a behavior, but about learning a new way to live. And above all, it teaches us that the darkest chapter of a person's life does not necessarily have to be the final one. Sometimes the story changes at the exact moment when we finally admit, I cannot do this alone. And perhaps that admission is not the end of strength. Perhaps it is where real strength begins. Because recovery does not begin when we become perfect. It begins when we become honest. It begins when we become willing. It begins when we stop running from the truth. And sometimes, it begins with something as simple as one alcoholic looking at another and saying, I understand. That is where connection begins. That is where hope begins. And for many people, that can be where a completely different life begins.